After World War II, 1945, 15 countries of the Soviet Union were communist and governed by Russia. Eastern European satellite communist states. They were independent on paper, but in reality were puppet governments of Moscow. 8 Eastern European countries outside the Soviet Union became communist after World War II. North Korea and China were already communist before the Vietnam War, 1954 to 1974. Cuba followed in 1960. Mozambique, Angola, Vietnam, and Laos also followed. In 1975, oil-producing countries, Iraq and Libya, and members of the OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, nationalized oil and signed treaties with the Soviet Union. Ecuador joined OPEC in 1973. 19 years later, in 1992, it left and returned again in 2007. The domino effect. If a country falls under communism, the communist idealism would spread to the neighboring countries and spread communism in the region.
France had colonized Vietnam in 1885. The end of World War II was the beginning of Vietnam's fight for independence from France. After a long fight, Vietnam got its independence from France after World War II. It was divided into Communist North and Capitalist South. Before we talk about the US intervention in Vietnam, let's look at some vocabulary about the Vietnam War. The USA and Soviet Union were involved in a Cold War after World War II in 1945 to 1991 over political differences. USA was capitalist and USSR was communist along with China. At this time, the US was involved in a Cold War with communist countries such as the Soviet Union and China.
The President of the USA in 1953 at that time was Harry Truman. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh. He was the North Vietnamese Prime Minister and communist. Ho Chi Minh got North Vietnamese independence from France in 1945.
Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and that worried Truman. You see, American lawmakers believed that if Vietnam became communist, the rest of Asia would too. It was called the domino theory. At first, the US gave the French money to help them win the war. But it didn't matter. The Viet Minh won victories. In 1954, France and Viet Minh signed a treaty dividing the country into Communist North Vietnam and anti-Communist South Vietnam. The government in the South wasn't very popular with its people, so the North Vietnamese used a transportation system called Ho Chi Minh Trail to send soldiers and supplies to the communist uprising in the South, but the US supported the South's anti-communist government. With money and advisors, then on August the 2nd in 1964, North Vietnamese boats fired torpedoes on US ships patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon Johnson got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It said that the US could use military force in Vietnam. At first, the force was limited to bombing, but at the end of 1965, there were 184,000 US troops in Vietnam and over 500,000 by the end of 1968. At first, everyone thought it would be an easy fight for the Americans. Their army was much more advanced and included a navy and air force. Not only that, but a lot of battles were fought in the dense jungle. The US Army was not equipped for this kind of war. But the Viet Cong, the communist soldiers in the South, fought a guerrilla war. They used small bands of soldiers to stage ambushes and build huge tunnel complexes to hide in. People couldn't understand why Americans had to die for a tiny country halfway around the world. Television, newspaper, magazines brought home images of innocent Vietnamese civilians killed by American bombs. Protesters marched against the war, sometimes peacefully, sometimes. But there were a lot of Americans who believed in the cause of the war, and they believed that protesters were weakening the soldiers' support. The hippie movement was growing and making the Vietnam War extremely unpopular in the 1960s and 70s. Eventually, President Lyndon Johnson stopped sending more troops to Vietnam. He even refused to run for president in the 1968 elections. Richard Nixon succeeded Lyndon Johnson in 1968.
Richard Nixon became president in 1968, promising to end the war with honor, but he didn't manage to make peace until 1973, after the election.
By the time the war was over, at least 1.2 million North and South Vietnamese were dead, and 58,000 Americans died in conflict. Once the American army pulled out, North Vietnamese invaded the South and unified the country under communist rule. Today, Vietnam is still mostly communist in its rule. Vietnamese invaded the South and unified the country under communist rule. Today, Vietnam is still mostly communist in its government.